What comes to mind when you hear the word science? How do you imagine that scientists work? Science teaches us about the world and how it works. Scientists build knowledge through inquiry. Join this group of scientists who work in the laboratory and in the field, attend conferences around the world, do library and internet research, collect data and conduct computer simulations, work with high-tech lab equipment, and discuss findings on the Tibetan Plateau. This is all science, and this is the process of scientific inquiry. Inquiry means questioning. These scientists have formed a research team to investigate the way natural processes work on Earth.
We're 7 American principal investigators. We all overlap to some extent with one another, but then each of us is different in some way or another.
I'm Peijin Zhang from Institute of Geology, State Seismological Bureau, which is based in Beijing. I was educated at the United States. I got my PhD at MIT. Peter Morna is my advisor.
Science is a process for building knowledge forged by scientists as they look for the answers about the world around them. Science is not just a set of facts, but also the process people use to uncover the facts and link them together. Just as you do in your science classes, researchers use the scientific process to answer many questions about how the world works. A scientific investigation always begins with a question. These scientists are studying how the Tibetan Plateau grew into a vast region of high mountains and how these mountains interact with the atmosphere.
Tibet is an unusual feature on the Earth today. It's the largest piece of real estate that is standing so high in the air. It's an area that's about the size of the eastern United States, but it's standing at higher than the highest peak that we have in the continental U.S. And so understanding that in and of itself has been a question that geologists have really been after for a long time.
So here's a picture with a cross-section of Asia. Roughly 60 million years ago, India lay south of Eurasia by some distance, and between them there was an ocean. And as India moved northward, eventually it collided with the southern edge, and in doing so it started to deform the whole of Asia as it pushed north, folding up and thrusting up blocks of Eurasia to build a high plateau. We're motivated by two questions. One question that concerns the plateau itself and how it grew as a geological feature. The second question concerns how does the plateau affect climate?
It's becoming increasingly obvious that future advances are going to involve bringing in other kinds of ideas from other communities. So for a long time, the individual sciences were separate approaches to science, working on very different problems. But I guess I'm an example. My training is in chemistry. I call myself a geochemist. So I bring together one component that can be brought to bear on the problem of interest. I don't actually work on faults. It's not what I do. I don't look at rocks in the field and try to understand them. But by working with somebody who can, we can do a lot more than either of us individually could do.
One of the really interesting things to me is to see how people who have such different characters and different skills can come together and work on the same problem. So myself, I'm quite mathematical. I want to write down an equation that I think explains how things work, and I want to solve that equation. Many of my colleagues have a very different approach. They scrabble up and down mountain ranges and pick up rocks and analyze those rocks chemically. But they never expect to be able to find a single equation which will explain how that works. It's more of a telling of a story.
So interdisciplinary science is fun because you just get to learn so much more. You get to talk to smart people. Smart people are always fun to listen to.
To have this kind of international project to be funded, you have to have a good scientific question. And second, you have to have a good team.
The first thing we did was we organized a field trip where nearly all of us went over there and spent 2 weeks with our Chinese colleagues just being shown around.
The scientists meet to plan how to investigate their research questions and prepare for the coming summer's fieldwork.
Okay, some cartoon histories of Tibet. First of all, India moved north and oceanic lithosphere was subducted underneath the southern edge of Tibet until roughly 50 million years ago.
The scientific method is really a recipe that we use, forming a hypothesis, testing a hypothesis, and then accepting or rejecting that hypothesis. And maybe most importantly is setting up the next hypothesis to test.
Getting up to speed at the beginning, a lot of reading before you can even pose a reasonable hypothesis that you can test. You really need to know the region that you're trying to work in. So there's a lot of reading of other people's work ahead of time.
Planning's a huge part of the research process, especially if you're going to be in a place as far away from us in the United States as China is.
A lot just like being a detective. You are snooping around for information. You don't always know exactly what you're going to find, but you have a pretty good idea of the types of things you need to be looking for to get at the answer.
When you're doing science for a job, you don't know the answer, nor does anybody else. Most broadly, science is about having an argument that you can back up with evidence that is a logical train of thought that takes you from an observation to an interpretation about the way that the world works. You can do that in many different ways, and we are using many of those different ways in trying to tackle this project.
Laboratory experiments are one way to gather evidence. So is fieldwork, observing plants, animals, and geologic features.
When we go to the field, often we're interested in trying to understand the distribution of these geologic features across a wide region. And the tools with which we use to collect that data are often maps. A geologic map represents where the rocks are. And then while we're trying to create this geologic map, we are making observations about the character of the rocks themselves. Are the rocks sedimentary? Were they deposited as sediments on the surface? Are the rocks old granites? Are they old bits of crystallized magma? The difference between those two tells us a lot about the history of that piece of the world.
You're setting up the experiment, but you're setting it up in the field. The way that we test a hypothesis as a geologist is we identify what kind of data we would collect in the field that would give us an answer as to whether our hypothesis is correct or not. One way that might work is if I hypothesize that these mountains in northeastern Tibet, did they grow progressively or did they come up all at once? And the way I might test that is to go out and try to get age data from each mountain range along the edge of the plateau.
In this specific project, we're trying to understand atmospheric processes. We're using rocks to look at that history, but the main goal is to understand the patterns of rainfall and changes in the patterns of rainfall over the history of climate in the region we're studying. Well, in the field, we spend most of the time literally sitting there with a meter-long stick. It's actually 1.5 meters, and we climb the mountains and measure the rock layers one at a time. We describe the layers in great detail on our way up. We're making interpretations constantly as we collect data.
So what Carmi is looking for is, did the climate change at the same time that we see the erosion patterns change that might tell us that mountain building has become more important or more productive?
After the scientists collect rock samples from field sites, they bring them back to the laboratory.
Good to be back in the States.
Welcome to the Surreal Lab.
We brought back probably 300 to 400 samples. Hopefully I'm getting help from Joe, who will help me to prepare the samples, to analyze the samples, and then the interpretation of it will take a good long while.
Every sample has a number assigned to it. This one is XUN 115, which means something to Brian, who collected this. But we have notebooks where we actually write all this stuff down so that anybody can look at the notebook and know what the sample is. Then using simple tools like this handy-dandy hammer, we crush the rock into a fine powder. This is a rock sample that's ready for analysis, just like that was crushed from the rock samples like we had on the table in there.
By analyzing the chemical makeup of the rock samples, the scientists find out about the properties of rain that fell on the rock millions of years ago. They can determine if the climate was wet or dry compared to today, and if the rain was carried by winds from the northern desert or from the oceans far to the southeast.
This is my lab at the California Institute of Technology. So we want to know when the rocks that we collect in Tibet cooled, which tells you something about when the plateau was produced. And so we go in the field, we collect usually granites, and take a sample that's about this big, send it off to separate out some of the minerals which are in the granite, and the minerals we're after are apatite and zircon.
Rock samples from the mountains are analyzed to determine their age. This helps tell whether the plateau grew quickly or slowly, all at once or in stages.
What I find interesting about this is we made all this stuff. Everything you see here is a part that you can buy out of a catalog, and it's like a bunch of tinker toys. And we stuck them together way no one else has ever stuck them together before. Something we dreamed up, like, hey, let's do it this way.
Invention is a vital part of the science process. Scientists invent new instruments and techniques to gather evidence in the lab and in the field.
Another technique that we use is called numerical modeling. We put all of the equations that describe how air circulates into a big computer, and we integrate those equations. We get the motion of the atmosphere produced by this model, and we can play with that model. What would the weather look like if there were no plateau? And so we can build up a picture in this imaginary world of how a different plateau would change the weather and change the climate. And we can try and relate those imaginary worlds to the data that we get from the geological observations. Which of our imaginary worlds look more like the data? Then if we find one, we can have some confidence that that was a picture of what happened in the past.
What we can begin to do is make educated guesses about which of those scenarios is most likely. You can take a climate model that does a good job of reproducing the modern climate. Then you can begin to cut out things like elevation and see what the effect of that is on the pattern of atmospheric circulation.
And many of the components are time-consuming. Someone's measuring isotopes, someone's dating individual grains of rock to figure out where they came from, someone else is mapping, other people are looking at gravity, etc. There are all these different aspects of it that you would spend a lifetime if one person was trying to do that. So collaboration is really important.
We will have to continue to discuss what the results that each individual is getting in a group. We come together every year for a meeting in the middle of the winter between field seasons, and we often come together in the field to share our observations.
You know, we know each other very well, and we have established a very good relationship, you know, in the field and in the office. So now we are just a group of friends doing science, solve the same problem.
It's important to be critical of ideas, to think of different ways of looking at things. Just coming up with an idea that explains a data set is it's valid, but it's better to think of all the different possibilities that could explain that data set so that you can figure out how to test an alternate hypothesis.
One of the fun things about a collaboration like this is that as we give presentations or talk about our data, there are a bunch of experts there that are scrutinizing it, thinking about it, and they ask questions both to make sure they understand what you've said and what your interpretation is, but also to point out possible other ways to interpret the data. The Tibetan Plateau is unique today in terms of this huge high area of topography, but it's not unique in terms of geological history, that if we go back to other continent-to-continent collisions, we would find similar sorts of plateaus. So by studying these modern situations, we develop some understanding that it can allow us to interpret ancient rocks which have been deeply eroded, and it's much more difficult to reconstruct what may have happened there. We get insights by looking at a modern situation like this.
Science is extremely iterative. We're always going through a process of revising our understanding of the way the world works based on the collection of new data. So we don't really collect facts, we're collecting evidence that support hypotheses.
Ordinary people, they probably see, scientists work hard, and they don't see, when scientists solve the problem and the pleasure they had.
I think what makes a good scientist is a combination of creativity and imagination, as well as rigor and discipline.
In geology, you're outside a lot, which is great. Being able to combine thinking creatively, working hard, and being outside is a perfect combination for some people, including me.
The essence of science, I think, is uncertainty. An essential part of science is this willingness to wallow around in what we're really not certain of. Where it's interesting is where we all disagree. We all want to move out into that area where it's not known, where the answer isn't clear, and we have to figure it out. The great thrill to a scientist is discovering something that others don't already know.
One of the big legacies that each generation leaves to the next is what it's understood more about the way things work, and passing that on is worthy. It's a great privilege to be part of that, but it's a very important thing that we do, filling up our libraries with understanding and knowledge.
If you have a question and you want to find the answer, you're doing science.
Clap.